Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Ashley Martin, and I'll be your host for today. I'm also joined by my co-host, Valen Kalika, Ryan Heffernan, and Jason Cohen. A few reminders before we start. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you are using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast. You can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask a Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. We often get many questions on these webinars, and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Azure Security Center forum at aka.ms/ASC community. We love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars. You can do so at aka.ms/security-webinar-feedback. And by the way, all the links that I'm announcing will be shared with you in the chat or live event Q&A window. I would also like to invite you to join our public community by visiting aka.ms/security-community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews at aka.ms/prsetcom. Request features, give feedback, review our product roadmaps, register for events, or join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Ronit Reger will take us through managing your security risk and compliance requirements with Azure Security Center. Ronit is a principal program manager with the Azure Security Center team. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ronit. Ronit, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining. Putting my screen up here so you all can see it and I can share the content with you. Thanks Ashley for the introduction. As Ashley said, my name is Ronit Reger. I am a program manager on the Azure Security Center team. I focus specifically on the areas of compliance and of security posture management in general. And today we're going to be walking through Security Center and how you can use Security Center to help manage risk and compliance requirements. So the focus is going to be on that today. And without further ado, we will get started. So today we're on the topic of compliance. So we have organizations across multiple industries, ranging from healthcare to finance, to government, to retail, all of whom have very specific compliance requirements that they need to meet and they need to deal with in order to make sure that their environments are complying with these very specific standards. These organizations need to go through audits, they need to meet these requirements and make sure that they get assessed and audited and therefore spend a lot of time and resources working through these different compliance requirements and standards. Now, even for organizations that aren't specifically in regulated industries, we find that they do use compliance standards as kind of a basis for their security policy and just their security foundation. So there are many sort of common compliance frameworks, such as the CIS control framework or the NIST control framework, that are very commonly used to sort of define that baseline set of requirements in order to define a security policy. So really, we're finding that most organizations that we work with and most customers on Azure are applying compliance requirements in one way or another. And then the question becomes, if these compliance requirements, again, whether specifically for audits within regulated industries or basing security policies on these compliance frameworks, if they were able to manage these in an on-prem environment or in a familiar environment before migrating to the cloud, then the question becomes, well, how do you translate these types of requirements into the cloud? When we were meeting this in a certain way with our on-prem deployments, now how do we take that and translate that to a cloud world? Because it's not exactly the same for these type of requirements. So in Azure Security Center, one of our principal tenets and values that we give to customers is what we call Cloud Security Posture Management, or CSPM. This concept is basically what enables you to track how your deployments and workloads are running in Azure from a security perspective. So ensuring that all resources are configured securely, ensuring that all workloads are totally secured in terms of how they connect to each other, ensuring that data is secure in terms of how the data is being handled and how that data is exposed, and so on. So the idea of Cloud Security Posture Management is really to give you this kind of overall sort of single pane of glass, bird's eye view into how your workloads are protected when they're running in Azure, and then take you through the process of actually going through and understanding where the insecure areas are, and then going through and all the way down to remediating issues in order to better secure your workloads. Now, part of the overall security posture management story is our elements like Secure Score, which help give kind of a score to give an overall posture assessment for where your workloads are, additional elements like remediation, and then regulatory compliance is part of that security posture management story as well. And today we'll be focusing on that compliance management element. So essentially the compliance part of security posture management is not only how do we manage the current kind of security posture status of workloads, but how does that align with compliance requirements? How can we translate that into understanding how we're meeting compliance requirements in Azure? So the compliance dashboard that is part of the security posture management offering in Security Center provides a number of different capabilities that help with that very goal of being able to monitor security status and aligning that with compliance requirements. So first of all, it is a continuous tracking mechanism where you always have the current status of what your compliance status is based on the assessments that we run on your resources in your Azure environment. And that's done using policies and recommendations in Security Center. Now, beyond that, it's actually taking the actual compliance requirements and translating those to Azure terms. So understanding how to meet those requirements, specifically with within an Azure environment and using solutions that are available in Azure. Now, another element here when we're talking about meeting compliance requirements in the cloud is what we call the shared responsibility model. So the shared responsibility model really talks about the elements that the platform is responsible for in meeting certain compliance requirements, being the cloud provider platform. And then the separation to the elements that the customer building their solution on top of that platform is responsible for. And each different compliance requirement has different separations into what kind of elements the platform is actually handling and what elements you need to worry about when you deploy your resources there. And so that's part of the value that we're giving with the compliance dashboard to show you what elements are covered by the platform, how they're covered by the platform, and then what you need to do on top of that in order to meet your elements of the requirements. Beyond this, and we'll go into detail with each of these soon, but you can also, beyond kind of managing compliance standard requirements, the compliance dashboard also gives you the ability to manage custom compliance standards. So if you want to build a custom policy based on a combination of requirements from different compliance standards, that's something that you're able to do with the compliance dashboard today as well. And we also have several reporting capabilities, which are critical for compliance scenarios, such as pre-built reports that you can export from the compliance dashboard, and an ability to continuously stream data, specifically compliance data, so that you have that data available over time. So these are some of the scenarios that the compliance dashboard helps you with today. We'll be running through each one of these in detail, and I'll be showing you how to actually apply the different capabilities that are available in the compliance dashboard. But we're also thinking about how to take the compliance dashboard to sort of the next level, to meet additional requirements that have to do specifically with compliance. If up to this point, we've really been thinking about how to sort of apply the security posture management principles to meeting compliance requirements, we're now also thinking about how to meet additional compliance-specific requirements, such as, for example, gathering evidence for compliance. So when you actually have to meet compliance requirements, then beyond securing configurations of resources in the environment, you also need to bring evidence that you can then show to auditors, showing how different resources were behaving over time, and other pieces of evidence that come from the environment. Another compliance-specific requirement has to do with manual control management. So being able to attest, for example, to specific controls with additional pieces of evidence and with attestations that you provide beyond the automatic data that we gather. And really, again, kind of beyond the capabilities that we offer today, we're thinking about how to kind of evolve this dashboard into really a single place in the Azure portal where you're able to manage all compliance requirements. And I would love for you to think about these additional requirements as we run through the compliance dashboard's capabilities today. Again, we'll be happy to hear feedback on what you feel is could be most beneficial in helping to meet these requirements. So let's think a little bit about who actually makes use of the compliance dashboard. And it turns out that there are a number of different sort of levels of personas and use cases for the dashboard. So on the one hand, we're seeing that central security officers or compliance officers in an organization are using this dashboard as sort of a higher level tool to understand what the organizational wide status is, and beyond that to actually define the organizational wide compliance and security policies. And these central security figures need to, again, from the kind of higher level of the organization, be able to validate how things are looking over time, and to be able to kind of track execution across the organization. We then have another group of kind of use cases that are around the actual implementers. So these are the specific workload owners or the subscription admins in Azure that are actually the ones going and tweaking the settings specifically for their workloads. And they're the ones that actually go and apply the remediations to resolve compliance gaps. So if the kind of central security officers are the ones that are tracking at a high level, the implementers are the ones that actually need to go and resolve the gaps and figure out what actions to take based on priority. And these folks are also the ones that need to be managing exemptions, for example, for their particular workloads, and dealing with either those exemptions and incidents and so on. And finally, we have another kind of group that cares about what they're seeing in the compliance dashboard, and that's the auditors. So again, for these regulated industries that need to track their compliance status, ultimately, they need to go to the auditor and show a body of evidence that demonstrates compliance. And so the compliance dashboard can also be useful for that type of scenario. where the auditor can actually review all of the compliance data in that central place and review all that evidence in order to achieve compliance. So when we think about how to design the different kind of scenarios that the compliance dashboard provides you, we're thinking about all these different types of use cases and personas. So we'll run through a little bit of what the compliance dashboard offers today, and I'll give you some information for how to actually apply all the different capabilities. And then, as I said before, we'll talk a little bit about where we're kind of taking this, and I would love for you to think about things that would be important to you in addition for compliance scenarios as we run through these. So first of all, for folks using the compliance dashboard in Azure, it's important to understand that the compliance experience is built on top of Azure policy. So essentially, in the Azure policy world, we have a number of compliance initiatives that are essentially compliance policy sets, and those sets of policies are then aligned and mapped to specific compliance requirements. And what we do in Security Center is build upon those sets of policies that are related to compliance requirements, and then show them to you in the dashboard in the framing of the different compliance requirements and how each of those different policies map to those requirements. So you'll see that there are initiatives in Azure policy corresponding to each of the different standards that we track in the compliance dashboard. We support a number of compliance standards today. This is an ever-growing list. So I've been working on this dashboard for a few years now, and we started with 4 standards, and now we're growing out quite nicely. So we do have the Azure Security Benchmark, which we'll talk about more as the default standard that appears in your compliance dashboard. Azure Security Benchmark is also part of the Azure Security Center kind of free tier and available to all Azure Security Center customers. And then we have several of these additional frameworks and standards that are part of the Azure Defender tier and can be onboarded to your dashboard as a paid Azure Defender customer. So again, the different standards that we support range from these common frameworks like Azure CIS and NIST through specific industry compliance requirements like HIPAA High Trust for healthcare, like PCI DSS for any organizations dealing with credit card information, like SWIFT for financial service industries, and so on. So we cover quite a range of compliance standards and requirements. If you are interested in tracking a set of requirements for compliance that you don't see here, then you actually also have an option to create a custom initiative or policy set in Azure Policy and onboard that to the compliance dashboard. So if you take a custom set of requirements, map those to policies, then you can actually onboard that and see that view and manage that in the Azure Security Center compliance dashboard in the same way that you would the built-in standards. So that's an option, and that's something that we see a lot of our customers doing. If there is a compliance standard that you would like to see as a built-in compliance standard to the dashboard, then share that information with us. We're always tracking to see what are the built-in compliance standards that organizations and customers are looking for, and working on prioritizing that backlog to add additional built-in standards here. So a little bit of a kind of how-to. As I mentioned before, the Azure Security Benchmark is the default standard that you will see showing up in your compliance dashboard. If you are looking to onboard additional compliance frameworks, then this is how you would customize your set of standards. Essentially, you come to the dashboard and go into Manage Compliance Policies. And by managing, sorry, jumped too fast there. By managing compliance policies, you'll see what additional standards are available to be then onboarded to the dashboard. And once you onboard a standard of interest, then it will actually appear here in the list of tabs that you can track in your dashboard. So this dashboard is always going to be kind of customized and tuned to your needs. In addition, the compliance dashboard enables you to download pre-built, pre-baked report for all of the compliance standards that are onboarded, that are currently onboarded to the dashboard. So basically, any of the standards that you onboarded, you will be able to download a report for. They'll appear in kind of the list of reports that you can download. And we have a couple of different options for reports. So once you do download a report, it'll give you a static view of exactly what the current compliance status is for your environment. And you can download, oh, this got messed up with the ordering now, I see, I'm sorry. The ordering is messed up, I'm sorry. So the different options for reports will be either a PDF report, which is basically an executive overview type report, a high level report of what the status is, or you can actually download a CSV report, which will show in detail the actual compliance status for each of the different resources in the specific scope that you downloaded the report for. So unfortunately, my slides were a little bit out of order, and now we're seeing that this goes back to customizing your standard with adding additional standards. And this is showing basically that you can onboard these additional standards through this set of tasks within the security policy, and then those standards will appear in the dashboard. So that is what we are seeing. So one of the things to highlight here is that overall your dashboard summary view shows, again, the kind of overall status for all of the set of standards that you currently have onboarded to the dashboard. Here in the main kind of dashboard pane, we're able to show the control status for a limited set of compliance standards, so only kind of 4 fit in here. But if you would like to see the status for all of the different standards that you've onboarded to your dashboard, you can go ahead and kind of click on this this show all here in the corner, and then you can see the control status for all of the standards that are currently onboarded to your dashboard. So in my case, I have 13 here that I've onboarded. Again, this will be applicable to the number of standards that you've onboarded to the dashboard. In addition, you have this information here that actually shows the scope that you're looking at. So when you onboard a particular standard to your environment, then you also are on board, you're selecting the scope essentially to which you are assigning that initiative or onboarding that standard. That can be onboarded and assigned to one or to multiple subscriptions. And you can actually see that the specific subscriptions that that standard is assigned to using this link. This will actually show the list of subscriptions. Now, keep in mind that the view you'll see here in terms of the applied subscriptions is entirely dictated by RBAC. So if in role-based access control, you as the kind of Azure user looking at this dashboard has access to all these 5 subscriptions, then you will see that the view and the status, the compliance status for those subscriptions. And when you click through, you'll see that those are the subscriptions it's applied to. Again, a different user may have a different view. For example, a workload owner that owns only a certain set of subscriptions that are applicable to their workload, then they will see essentially only the applications of the standard to those subscriptions. So one of the basic tenets of what we do with Security Center posture management is not only show the overall status for how your resources are complying with the different requirements, but we always make this actionable. So again, for that same persona or user that is actually going in and needs to go in and remediate issues and handle issues that are out of compliance, then the compliance dashboard provides a very clear sort of drill down into the specific issues and a way to then go and directly remediate from the experience. So we can see an example of a particular compliance check or policy failing for a certain number of web applications. You can then click through to that and see the full information for that assessment, for that recommendation, with information, kind of details for what are the remediation steps that need to be taken to resolve that for the resources. And then we also have the quick fix capability to be able to actually go and remediate in a click or remediate at scale if there are multiple resources. So all of the kind of rich capabilities of Security Center to go and understand how to remediate issues and to remediate at scale are available as part of the path within the compliance experience as well. So this is jumping back to the reports we talked about earlier. Again, sorry about that out of order. But this is showing the, if I mentioned earlier, the PDF reports that are kind of high level status versus the CSV reports that really do give that detailed information for exactly what is the compliance status for every single resource that is currently deployed in your environment. So these are two different types of reports that can be used to help to, again, download as a baked-in report and be able to get a file copy of what your current compliance status is. So another addition that kind of has to do with report management as well is an ability to actually go and see all of your detailed compliance data using an Azure Resource Graph query. So what we're doing behind the scenes is basically persisting all of the current compliance data to Azure Resource Graph. And that means that all that data is readily available to you to then go into the Data Explorer for Azure Resource Graph and slice and dice according to your needs. So we actually, when you go ahead and click on this button from the dashboard to open an R query, then this will actually open the query that we use to export that CSV report. So this is the basis of the query that brings all the data directly for the CSV report. Now, if you want to customize this and tweak this for your needs and create a custom report or create a custom view, then you're able to do that with Azure Resource Graph. And you can see here easily how all the data is modeled and then use the different Data Explorer capabilities to go and run whatever queries you'd like to run on your data. Another thing that you probably noticed as we went through the compliance dashboard is that it contains information and compliance status not only for your Azure resources and not only for standards as they apply to Azure, but also for multi-cloud compliance management. So we expose information for how your AWS resources, if you've onboarded an AWS account to Security Center, then we can show you how those AWS resources are meeting the AWS CIS standard, for example, within the compliance dashboard. Similarly, for AWS PCI, you can see how the assessment of your AWS resources are meeting AWS PCI, and we support GCP standards as well. So we have these appearing in the dashboard today, and as Security Center builds out more capabilities in the multi-cloud space, you'll see this area growing as well with more capabilities to manage multi-cloud deployments within the single pane of glass for managing compliance requirements as well. One of the other important elements of managing specific compliance assessments is also the process of managing exemptions for those. So again, if we go back to the workload owner or implementer that is seeing a particular status for their compliance standing for certain resources, and seeing some failure for which they know that they need an exemption, then we need a process here to enable them to go and actually seek an exemption for that particular assessment and manage that exemption and manage that process. So that is actually something that can be done directly through the compliance dashboard as well. If there's a particular element that needs an exemption, then the workload owner can go in here and actually select the resource or resources for which they need to request an exemption and go ahead and create that exemption within the experience itself. So this is all building on top of the Azure policy exemption process. Within Azure policy, you can define such exemptions on specific resources. And so we are building on that to enable those exemptions to be defined. Once you exempt a resource from a particular policy or assessment, then you'll see that that no longer shows as failing, and that exemption can also be tracked over time. So again, you define kind of the exemption scope, but you can also define an expiration date and provide additional information for that exemption, such as, for example, whether the exemption has been mitigated in some way with more information, or if there's a particular waiver, and then that's something that's an object that can actually be tracked within the system as an exemption. So that can be very helpful, again, for compliance scenarios where, for example, an auditor needs to specifically see the status of exemptions as well and be able to see all this information for those exemptions. So another rich capability that we have within Security Center and can also be applied to compliance is what we call workflow automation, or essentially the ability to automate compliance tasks rather than having to go in and manually address anything any kind of state change that takes place with compliance. So, and this is something that we find that a lot of customers are very interested in doing, to be able to, as much as possible, go ahead and create automations for compliance tasks so that they don't have to go in and manually address every individual state change. So within the Security Center experience, you can also actually create an automation task that triggers anytime a certain event happens. Now, you can control that trigger. So that trigger can be a state change or a very specific state change that you can define. You can create triggers for one standard or multiple standards depending on the requirements. So you can select kind of what the specific standard will trigger that change or trigger that event. And then based on the trigger, create an automation action to go ahead and automate response to that state change. And here you can actually use logic apps to create whatever automations you're interested in creating. We have some built-in logic apps that can be used, such as opening a ticket or sending an email. So that can help kind of automate that full compliance process of opening a ticket to handle a state change and then tracking that ticket in an external ticketing system over time. The, again, ability to send email and even to do auto remediation. So you can actually define automation to go ahead and automatically remediate anytime a particular trigger for a compliance state change takes place. So this automation is something that's really beneficial for customers to be able to automate those tasks. Another important capability for compliance that we've recently added is the continuous export capability. So if earlier we talked about the static reports and baked-in reports that you can export and create a current point-in-time report, whether, again, an executive summary or a detailed CSV report for the current compliance state, the continuous export enables you to configure the compliance data continuously being exported to a particular external system, and then you can track that data over time. So, for example, if you configure this continuous export to export to a log analytics workspace, then you can gather all of your overtime compliance data in a log analytics workspace, and then you can use that to build different types of overtime reporting and any additional requirements that you can build on log analytics. We have many customers that actually also use the continuous export capability to stream data to event hubs, and then from there to external governance, risk, and compliance systems, so that all of the data from the Security Center compliance dashboard can then be managed centrally in a governance, risk, and compliance system that they have externally. So the continuous export really does give the sort of flexibility to determine what data is being exported, in which way. We have snapshot exports where you can export a snapshot of all of your compliance data at once. We have the kind of continuous delta essentially exports where data is being exported anytime there's a state change. So you have these different options that you can use to export this data. We mentioned earlier about the compliance requirements in cloud having this additional element of the shared responsibility model. So for any compliance requirement, there's going to be, in some cases, an element where it's entirely, that requirement is entirely managed by the platform. So it's what we call a Microsoft managed control that Azure handles. And some requirements are going to be entirely your responsibility as the customer, what we call customer managed controls. So certain configurations that you need to make in the resources and workloads that you deploy. And many of the controls are going to be shared responsibility. So there's actually going to be, again, that kind of that border of, okay, there's the platform responsibility element and then the customer responsibility element. And one of the things that we've added to the compliance dashboard, this is available right now for the NIST standards, NIST 853, R4 and R5 standards, but we'll be growing this out over time, is that kind of view of, for each control, is it Microsoft responsibility? So is this control entirely handled by the platform? Is this control entirely handled or should entirely be handled by the customer, or is this shared? And then the different requirements that you would have as a customer for this control versus specifically the details for what Microsoft does as a platform to meet the Microsoft responsibility part of this control. So this data also for the Microsoft responsibility can be very important for audits. So to actually show to auditors, okay, this is our kind of evidence and proof of what the platform does here to meet their part of the control. And then you can use the data for the customer responsibility for the evidence on what you are doing to configure those workloads. So for a bit more detail here, you can see here an example of a control that Microsoft shows basically what the implementation details are for how Microsoft addresses its element of this control. And again, all of this data can be used to help understand what the platform is doing and to help apply to audits. Another useful piece of information that we've recently added to the dashboard is what we call compliance control information. So mostly what you saw in the dashboard up until this point was just kind of the title of the control and then the different assessments that are mapped to that control, and then you go and actually take action on those assessments. But in addition, sometimes it's important to understand what are the actual details and requirements within that control itself. So we have this new ability now to actually click on the control details, and then you can see information for that particular control, what it's actually requiring, understand more about what the requirement in the control means and what kinds of things you need to do to ensure that you're meeting that in a compliant way. So back in sort of the space of the shared responsibility model, one of the things that we know that many customers require, again, for the purpose of their auditors and for the purpose of the audit portion of the organization, is to have access to Microsoft certifications for how Microsoft is compliant with certain compliance standards, based on industry requirements and so on. So these kind of audit reports, so these are certifications that show the evidence for Microsoft meeting these different requirements as a platform. And these documents were available in the Compliance Service Trust portal on the web up until a while ago. And we've now actually brought these audit reports into Azure Security Center so that you can go ahead and download them directly from Security Center. Again, enabling you to kind of handle all compliance-related needs within Azure Security Center itself. And we publish reports here for these different compliance requirements for ISO, PCI, SOC, high trust, and some additional industry and regional standards. This is also kind of growing out as we have these additional certifications that need to be provided to customers. And you can go ahead and any Azure customer can go ahead and download any of these reports. You don't need to be in Azure Security Center. You don't even need to be onboarded to Security Center to be able to do these, and certainly don't need to have a Defender tier. So really anyone that has an Azure subscription has access to these. What we do though is track downloads for these audit reports. So part of our auditing, part of our certification requirement is to ensure that we have tracking for anyone that downloads these reports so that if anything does change, we're able to notify and update customers that have downloaded the reports. So another exciting addition that we have to the compliance dashboard is actually managed in a slightly different place. You access this through workbooks, and this is what we call the compliance overtime workbook. So this is actually built on the continuous export capability that we talked about earlier. You actually need to set up a continuous export of your compliance data to a log analytics workspace in order to light this up. But once you do that, we're able to actually create a built-in report or workbook to track compliance over time for all of the standards that you're tracking. So this is great. It has flexibility to define the workbook for different scopes. So you can, again, kind of set up for different subscriptions the export of compliance data and track that here for different standards. Depending on the standard you're interested in, you actually have a filter where you can select which standards you'd like to track over time. And this report is very sort of built in a drill down fashion. So while the main pane shows sort of the overall overtime behavior of all of the standards that you're tracking, you can actually start drilling down to a particular standard and then understand in detail for the different controls how they're behaving over time. And then for a particular control, go ahead and drill down and understand the specific assessments for that control, how that is behaving, how those are behaving over time, and basically drill down all the way through to specific assessments and down to the resource level. So this gives kind of the full view of the overall overtime behavior and then drilling down to a resource level. This is similar to what we have in workbooks with the Secure Score Overtime workbook. So we have a similar kind of experience for tracking secure score overtime, and this specifically is focused on compliance overtime. Another thing to mention here is that since this is a workbook, you can actually go in and modify and update the workbook and customize it if you have additional dashboarding needs that you would like to address here. So that's something that can be really useful as well. A little bit more on the Azure Security Benchmark. So we keep kind of talking about the Azure Security Benchmark as the default standard that you're seeing in the compliance dashboard. And there's a good reason for that. The benchmark is really the kind of canonical set of security guidelines for Azure, and not only security guidelines and best practices, but also how they align with compliance frameworks. So the Azure Security Benchmark was really built on top of kind of foundational compliance controls from CIS and from NIST, and we'll soon be extending that to to a foundation from PCI as well. And taking those common compliance frameworks and really defining the kind of translation of all of those requirements specifically to the Azure space and how those align with best practices in Azure. So customers are finding this super useful to be able to use that security benchmark really as a common sort of benchmark, right? A common way to track the different compliance and security controls and requirements, how to best track those in Azure. A little bit about the relationship between the benchmark and the different frameworks that it maps to. So basically a framework like NIST or CIS or PCI is going to include a lot of controls that are applicable to Azure, applicable to the cloud and to resources in the cloud. But it's also going to cover additional things, things that have to do with processes within an organization or with team training or with different things that are not really kind of Azure technical controls. The Azure Security Benchmark takes basically a union of all of the technical controls that are applicable to Azure from all of those frameworks and creates kind of a conglomerated framework that includes all of those technical controls that are specifically cloud-centric and specifically how to apply and achieve those controls in a cloud environment, and then of course specifically how to implement that within Azure. Now, the security benchmark is actually the underlying framework and the underlying set of policies that Security Center uses as its security posture framework. And you know that within Security Center, there is the secure score that is able to then measure, give a measurement based on risk assessment also and based on prioritization, what the current status is. But essentially that secure score, while scoring each of the different elements, is actually built on top of the definition of the benchmark itself. So the benchmark kind of gives that underlying framework for controls, for requirements, for best practices, and then secure score builds on that with integrating, again, that risk assessment, the threat intelligence that kind of build into that to help understand the impact of each of the different issues with a scoring mechanism, and then gives you an overall score based on that. So we've pretty much covered all of the different things that the compliance dashboard is able to do today, and how you're able to use that to meet your different compliance scenarios. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what's in the roadmap for the compliance dashboard. So first of all, you've already seen that that we do support some multi-cloud standards, again, enabling you to kind of centralize the management of compliance for cloud requirements, whether in Azure, AWS, GCP, and extending to multi-cloud. That's something that we already support in a basic way today, and we're going to be extending that significantly going forward as well. So you can see a lot more of the ability to really track compliance across clouds within the compliance dashboard. A couple of the other elements that we kind of hinted at before is that we want to be able to take the things you're able to do within the compliance dashboard beyond pure kind of security posture management capabilities to additional compliance scenarios, like manual control management, which actually enables you to attest to controls, to attach evidence, to address compliance scenarios in that way, to the automatic gathering of evidence that could be required for compliance, and the ability to create kind of a full audit report for auditors that includes not only compliance status for resources, but also that additional evidence that's often required by auditors. Again, these are some of the things we're looking at in the roadmap, and we would love also to understand back from you, the community, what would be kind of most beneficial in being able to basically manage all of your compliance needs and scenarios within this type of experience. In addition, we see that many organizations want to basically take their existing security framework or compliance framework, right? Typically, the security framework is built on compliance principles, and actually kind of port that into Azure and be able to translate into Azure terms. So we're also working on an ability to help that process, to help map those controls that folks are bringing in from their own custom security frameworks, and to map those to the common compliance controls that we have in Azure to identify the relevant assessments that we can run in Azure to help meet those controls. For folks that are familiar with Azure Purview, Azure Purview has, I think, just recently announced general availability for the ability to classify and label data. And we are working on being able to enrich our security posture data and compliance results with Purview data. So basically, an ability to understand beyond the status of resources and how they apply to compliance, actually understand deeper what type of data classification is there, use that classification and labeling data to then enrich the compliance experience. And of course, having that type of deep information on data can also help us light up additional compliance standards and privacy standards, so that we can actually cover those controls as well. And finally, we're working on enhancing the user experience within the dashboard, giving you more ability to just kind of filter through different things, customize your views, different types of summaries of views that we think could be helpful there. So again, back to you, the community, any kind of dashboarding experiences that you think would be helpful for you, we're always happy to hear, and that will help us prioritize the enhancements that we make in that space. So we've seen what the compliance dashboard in Security Center does. It gives you that ability to continuously track your compliance state for all supported standards in Azure. You're able to generate those reports, including what the platform does for the shared responsibility model and what the customer needs to do, and create, whether it's kind of built-in reports that are point in time, or the overtime views if you need that information for overtime reporting. You're able to use that Azure Security Benchmark as essentially that union or superset for translating different security and compliance requirements to a cloud world, to an Azure world, and we're hard at work ensuring that you have state-of-the-art Azure security implementations to help meet the requirements that we're and the bar that we're setting with the Azure Security Benchmark. And again, the principle of the compliance dashboard is to really provide you a central place to manage compliance needs, whether for Azure, whether for multi-cloud. The more we can build to help you manage those compliance tasks in one place, then the better we've done our job. So with that, I'm going to open up to questions.
Thank you, Ronit. Thank you for being our guest today and for the excellent presentation. We do have one last question here. Can you give me an example of how long it took between a CIS benchmark being released and then implemented in compliance dashboard? The reason for asking is this delay is being used as a reason not to run with ASC benchmarks and instead do it manually. I can't find any empirical data on which to make a decision.
So interesting. Actually, one of our points of pride was that when the Azure CIS 1.3.0 version was released, I think that was it's almost a year ago now, around November or December, we actually had that lit up in the compliance dashboard and security center within about a month. And that was, we were actually quite proud of that. We worked very, very closely with CIS. We actually worked with them closely also to ensure that their benchmarks were kind of best aligned with what we see as the best practices in Azure as well, to make sure that they are kind of up to date on the kind of latest and greatest in Azure, and that's what's represented in their benchmarks. So for the 1.3.0 version, we worked very closely with them on that. And once that got released, we were sure to light that up as an Azure policy initiative. So as a policy set, and then soon after within Security Center within 1 or 2 months. So that was actually, it felt like it was pretty quick. If the community feels that there kind of are additional things that we should be looking at in that space, then again, we're happy to hear.
Great. Thank you so much again for being our guest today, and thank you to everyone who helped answer questions. At the same time, I'd like to remind the listeners that the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements is to visit our landing page at aka.ms/securitycommunity. And while there, you'll find easy ways to navigate and find the resources and learning content relevant to our security products and their communities. A good start would be browsing our bite-sized product videos, ninja trainings, recordings of past webinars, GitHub communities, and more. We'd love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars. Please take a minute submitting your feedback at aka.ms/security webinar feedback. Thank you and see you next time. Goodbye.